Do you feel this shiver right now? It is as if something is observing every movement of yours. In the next few moments, you will face a dark secret that few dared to reveal. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and leave your like to follow everything until the end. Now get ready to get into a story that can change what you think about the unknown. Hello everyone, is very welcome to our channel, where the shadows of the night take shape. Through the reports you send me today, I bring another video with reports sent directly to our email. Each story I receive is carefully edited by me to ensure that the essence of horror is preserved while protecting the privacy of those who decided to narrate their most with us. Though I believe in the reality lived by those who send me these emails, I must remember that I have no way to prove the veracity of events, so it remains for you believing or not. My name is Gail, and for many years I was guardian of the graves in the cemetery of village of Santa Serafina, a forgotten villa, place of dread owner, and reports that no one wanted to remember for me was home. Not that I lived in him, of course, but my little house was so close that I could hear the breeze whistling between tombsticks at night. That cemetery was old almost as much as the village. They said that the first settlers built it around 1800, but today in 1975 was just a forgotten place. The bush grew where it should not be. The chapel downtown was in ruins, and the wall full of cracks looked like it was going to fall any moment. The authorities didn't even remember that the place existed, and the few burials that happened there were from poor families without choice. I took care of him alone, cleaned the dried leaves, ended the crosses that the breeze knocked down, and put flowers on the abandoned tombstones was not an easy craft. But I did, with respect. Always thought that if no one was coming to take care of the dead, someone had to do this they deserve. But I'm not silly. I don't know very well that the cemetery carries a different weight. The village people said no one should climb the hill at night. Spirits don't rest, they said. I never listened to. I spent nights there, times digging a pit until late, other times just listening to the stillness. And I will be honest, stillness sometimes bothers you more than noise. Was on an afternoon grey that it all started. I was finishing aligning some tombstones when I heard the snoring of a car rising. The dirt road was not any car, was one of those great blacks and glossy as I had only seen in burials of important people. I stopped what I was doing and watched the car stopped well at the entrance, and from there came two men in black suit, carried a serious look, as if were used to dealing with entities that no one wanted to know. Behind them came an old man, with the tired glimpse and a heavy whisper. "Good afternoon, Lord," said one of the men of dry suit. "Like the winter breeze, we brought a body to be buried. Is urgent. Body to be buried so far. Anything unusual was my final craft." But there was something unusual there, Hurry. The way they looked around, as if were terrified of something. It was different. I looked at the coffin that they carried, simple dark wood, but something in that scene did not beat the Lord. "Is the guardian of the graves?" Frey asked, staring at me as if he wanted to know more than answer. "I am, yes, sir." "But who is the deceased?" I asked, trying to look natural. He exchanged looks, did not like the question. Man of suit responded. After cleaning his throat, "Is a lady. We do not have permission to publicize the details. We only need a discreet location." I had seen everything there in the cemetery, but that was unusual, even for me. They wanted a quick burial, and without registration, and it bothered me. But as much as my curiosity shouted, it was not my role to ask questions, right? "I will prepare the place," I answered, pointing to a corner of the farthest cemetery where the tombstones were almost hidden by the bush. While I dug, I felt the Frey's glimpse over me. He didn't take the eyes of me or the coffin, as if I expected something to leave at any moment. "The Lord is very Frey?" I asked, cleaning the sweat of the forehead. He hesitated, but answered only, "And so that the wicked not pass this place." That gave me a chill. I was a practical man, knows. I never went to believe in haunting reports, but the whisper in his whisper made me uncomfortable after. We ended the burial. They were not wasted time. The Fry prayed a quick prayer, and the men of suit threw the earth on the coffin as if they wanted to end it as soon as possible. When Frey finished, called me and handed me a white candle. Senor Gael, keep it on at night is important. And why I asked it suspiciously replied, just to ward off what does not belong to the living world. In that night, when the stillness returned to the cemetery, I got the candle next to me. I don't know what bothered me more. What Friar said, or what I felt as if something was out of place. And that's when the murmurs started. Later of that night, things started to change in the cemetery. But before I tell us what happened, I need to explain something. I was always a practical man. I never listened to haunting reports or seeing things where there was nothing. I grew up listening to the old village talk about penalty spirits, but I had never seen anything that proved it was truth. At least to that burial the next day, I returned to the craft. As of usual, the cemetery seemed the same as the always forgotten old and more quiet of what should be. I started the day by cleaning the accumulated leaves nearby the hermitage, but the feeling that someone watched me did not leave me was not rare. I spent hours there without seeing a living soul, but this time was different. Quiet seemed heavy, as if there was a hidden entity in the air. Was when I realized the candle that Friar gave me, and that I had left the night before. It was erased. I couldn't be the breeze because I had put it inside a glass flashlight, and yet the next morning it was completely consumed. I laughed alone, thinking I was impressed with the phrase talk, but deep down, something didn't leave me alone. As I swept the ways between the tombs, passed through the corner where we had buried the lady, nothing out of place. At least at first glance, the earth was still fresh, but that was all. The unusual was the presence that seemed to be around that corner of cemetery. I was not praying, but at that moment, I made the sign of the cross, and I muttered something like, "The Most High protect me." I thought if it was just my head, that would calm me night. But the thing was, my little house was simple, with a bed, a table, and an opening that gave to the cemetery was just enough to live. After dinner, I sat at the table with a glass of cachaça. To relax, was quiet until I heard it was low, but there was a kind of murmur, as if someone were talking secret, but I couldn't understand the words. The sound seemed to come from out. At first, I thought it was just the breeze. I got up. I took my flashlight and I went to the opening. I looked out for the tombs, scattered through the hill. Anything but. The murmurs continued to close the opening and tried to ignore, but the truth is that my chest was fired because the hell I was listening to, that I decided to leave and take a look. I took my coat to the flashlight and the shovel because, well, and never. Outside the night was cold and quiet, absolute stillness, except for my steps over the wet gram. The sound of the murmurs seemed to move from different places, as if something is playing with me. Follows to the corner where the Mueller had been buried, because deep down I knew it was wrong with that tomb when I got there. My feet frozen. I don't know if it was the cold or the fear, but I was paralyzed. The land of the tomb was rummaged, as if someone had fallen there with my own hands. I lowered myself to look closely. It seemed like animal work was like something came out of the way. Suddenly, I felt a shiver up the spine. The flashlight trembled in my hand, but I forced the light forward. It was then that I heard that again, the murmurs, but now they were higher, coming straight from the tomb, and in their midst I could swear. I heard my name, Gale. At that moment I left, call me coward, but I'm just a man, and that was more than me. I could take the door of my residence and locked everything I passed the rest of the night, sitting on the bed holding the flashlight and candle that Friar had given me, praying like never prayed. Before the next day, I did what any sensible person went to the temple wanted to know. Who was that lady? Needed to understand what they had buried in my cemetery. Friar, who had celebrated the burial, was no longer there, but the new parish priest. Young man named Friar Samuel received me, tell me what had happened without hiding anything. He heard everything in silence, and when I finished, he just said, "One thing you shouldn't have approached that tomb. When Friar Samuel told me that I shouldn't have, I am approaching the tomb. I felt the weight of his words in the chest. Was as if he knew something, that was not willing to say what the Lord means with it. Frey asked. He hesitated, straightening the glasses as he looked at the floor of temple wood. Was not the same kind of friar I had seen in the Samuel burial. Was young, full of energy, but it seemed uncomfortable with the subject. Sometimes the dead carry entities that the living cannot understand, and what was buried in that cemetery, it should be there. The Lord is telling me that the lady who buried swallowed dry is not just a lady. I sighed. I can't say anything without evidence, but the friar who brought her mentioned that there was something in common in the case. The body should not have been buried here. So why it was, Samuel was silent for a moment before answering. Because no one would accept this phrase hammering in my head as I returned to the cemetery. They brought the body there because no one else wanted to accept. And now, who was paying the price was me, who lived and worked next to that tomb. That night, I took all the precautions that I could rekindle the candle that Friar had given me, and put a handbook of coarse salt around the residence. Was something my grandmother taught me when I was a boy. And at that moment, I didn't care if it seemed superstition. Any entity was wrong, and I needed to protect myself. That protection didn't seem enough. It was around the midnight that noise started again. Were not just murmurs this time. There are light steps, as if someone was walking between the tombs. But every time I looked at the opening, I saw nothing. I had closed the openings and locked the door, but felt that it did not suddenly make the light of the candle shaking almost out, and that's when I heard it wasn't just my name, but a hoarse and dragged whisper saying something that made the blood freezing. You opened the door to gate. Was even being locked. I took planning, holding the flashlight and the shovel like weapons. My hand trembled so much that I almost let the flashlight fall. Who is there? Shouted, trying to sound firm, but my whisper came out weakly. The stillness came back, but only for a moment. I heard a sound behind me coming from the room. When I turned something that I will never forget. A high and thin shadow projected on the wall. Only there was no one there to make that shadow. It moved on its own, as if it had life before I could do anything. The candle erased completely and everything got dark. Gale. The whisper murmured again, now closer. I ran out. I'm not brave, I'm not hero. Opened the door and ran out, stumbling into the dark until reaching the hermitage in the middle of the cemetery. Did not know where to go anymore, but at that moment it seemed the only safe place. I closed the hermitage door behind me and knelt before the altar, trying to recover the breath. The hermitage was in ruins, with benches broken and old images of dust. Uncovered saints, but it was still a place of faith. I took a cross that was on the altar and held it hard, but stillness did not last. I heard the steps outside the hermitage, tall, closer to the Ranjou door, as if something was pushing, trying enter. I didn't know what to do, so I started praying even without remembering the words. Suddenly, the push stopped and the stillness came back, but it was not a normal. Stillness was like the air was hard, heavy, breathe. Then I heard a knock, not on the door, but in something inside the hermitage, the flashlight illuminating the seats and the dark corners, anything, until the light stopped, in an entity that made me almost drop the flashlight on the wall next to the altar. Someone had written with land or blood, I don't know, but it was there. She was never. Although that night I didn't go back to residence. I spent the rest of my time sitting in Champ de Hermitage, holding the cross and waiting for the dawn. The next day I went straight to the temple to tell Friar Samuel what had happened. He heard me silent, but in the end said something that made me even more restless. Gale, I think we need to dig up that coffin. I knew it wasn't going to end well that morning when Friar Samuel suggested digging up the coffin. My first reaction was to deny. It wasn't just for fear and look, I was terrified, but also because it moves the rest of the dead is wrong. But he insisted, Gale, this is not a common body. I know that I need your help. I was quiet. The truth is that he was right. Since the day when that coffin was buried, something more had been normal, so as much as my instinct I said to escape, I knew I had to do something right. Frey answered later, to think a lot, but I want to know what exactly we are facing him. He hesitated, looking at the opening of the sacristy, as if he didn't want to say what he was thinking. I don't know everything, but the story about people like her ladies who in life they dealt with dark entities cursing pacts when these people die. Do not rest. The word pacts made my stomach turn. It was not rare to hear reports of witch in the region, mainly in the most remote parts of Sertão. Duceara said that they did works to harm others, but I always thought it was just... Only now that didn't look like folklore. So you think she was a witch? I asked, trying not to stutter. The friar took a deep breath. Not only a witch, she must having done something much worse. He didn't explain anymore, but it was enough to look into his eyes to know that he had not. Sure. If we were ready for what we were going to find at night, when the cemetery was already wrapped in the dark, we prepared to bury. The tomb was only me, and it was there, wrapped, no one else. Because who would believe the people of the village already dreaded enough of that place? I took the shovel and we started digging. The earth was more heavy than it should, as if something below wants to prevent us with each removable summer night layer. Suddenly, I felt a strange smell, as something rotten. Mixed with iron, you are feeling it? Asked the friar who dug beside me. He agreed but did not stop. His hands trembled, but he continued as if his life depended on that, and perhaps it would depend even when we finally reached the coffin, hesitated. He was covered with marks that were not there on the day of the burial. Symbols carved in wood, as something I had never seen before, were figures, geometrics and intertwined lines, but there was something sinister in them, as if had been made by hands that did not belong to this world. Gael held the lantern. The friar asked for cleaning the sweat of the forehead. He took a crucifix and started muttering a prayer. I didn't know if it would help, but only the sound of his whisper was a consolation. When we opened the coffin, the world seemed to stop. The body was, but it was not the way it should. Being there was no sign of decomposition. Even after days buried, the face of the lady was intact, pale as wax, but the eyes, they were open, fixed in us. I almost knocked the flashlight, but Friar held my arm. Do not look directly, he said, hurried. And now what we do? My whisper almost did not leave before something happened. The air around us, heavy as if a storm was about to start, and then the sound came. First a low, distant murmur, after laughs of various voices, some bass, other acute, but all mixed. The fray began to pray more high. But the voices also increased until one of them stood out of "You should not be here." The flashlight erased me in the dark, listening. To the friar, scream something Latin as the coffin was beginning to tremble, didn't know what. It was happening, but I felt we couldn't stay there. "Friar, we have to leave," I shouted, trying to pull him. "No," he answered. "We have to finish the ritual." Floor began to vibrate, and the smell of rot was so strong that I could barely breathe. Something surrounded us, something that we couldn't see, but it was there. So before I could react, I felt a force pushing me back on the floor, and when I managed to get up, I saw the friar being dragged away from the tomb. He held the crucifix with strength, but something invisible, pulling him quickly toward the chapel, ran after him, shouting the name. But it seemed that the cemetery itself was, I saw, trying to keep me from reaching him. Tumblings seemed to change places, blocking my way, while shadows, they danced around me. When I finally reached the hermit, the door knocked on my dude. I screamed, knocked on the door, but she didn't open inside. I could hear the friar screaming and praying and crying, then that everything was silent till the door of hermitage opened alone. But friar was no longer there, and on the wall above the altar there was one more message written with blood. "She is already released." The message on the wall of the hermitage, written with blood, was recorded in my eyes. She is already loose. At that moment, I was paralyzed, did not know if the friar was alive or dead, but one thing was certain. He had been taken by something I couldn't understanding, and the cemetery was no longer just a rest place for the dead, was a battlefield. I took the crucifix that the friar had dropped and left the hermitage looking around with the flashlight in hand. The cemetery seemed different. Tumblings were covered with a thick mist, and the air was cold as if the own place was alive. I did not know what to do, but running was not an option, not while that entity was still there. I returned to my residence, but the sense of security I used to have disappeared as soon as I closed the door. I heard a sound that I will never forget. A weak and dragged cry coming outside was the cry of a lady. For a moment I thought to ignore. I didn't want to know what it was, but the sound didn't stop. I took the flashlight and I was shaking from head to toe. The cry came from the big tree next to the wall of the cemetery. When I got there, the flashlight lit up a figure sitting on the floor. Back to me was a lady with long and black hair, using a torn white dress spotted by... Lady asked, trying to control the fear in my whisper. She stopped crying and turned her head slowly, as if the movement were harder than it should when it looked at me. My body freezes. Her face was the same as the lady we had buried. "Why did you wake me up?" she asked with the lowest, shorter whisper I couldn't answer. My hands trembled so much that the flashlight fell to the floor, turning out the light. The stillness returned, and when I tried to get the flashlight, she disappeared. It was then that I felt something behind me, a presence. I turned slowly, and I saw a high shadow than anyone I had ever seen. Stop a few meters from me was not human, was a twisted figure with two long arms and a leaning head as if they were studying me before I could run. She moved, and too fast. I felt an invisible strength pushes me back, throwing me on the floor with so much strength that the air escaped from my lungs. The figure was over me, and even without eyes, I knew that I was looking at me. I shouldn't have messed with me, she said with a whisper that seemed to come from 1,000 mouths. At the same time, I struggled to get up, holding the crucifix as if they were my last hope. When I touched her with the crucifix, she retreated, screaming in pain. But her cry was not a normal cry, was how the glass breaking high and unbearable. I took advantage of the chance to run, stumbling on the way back. To the residence inside my residence, I locked the door and threw myself on the floor, trying to understand what was happening. The lady we buried, or whatever she went, was not just a witch. She was something worse. Something I couldn't face alone. Was when I remembered the friar. He said we needed to finish the ritual, but he did not explain how I took the crucifix and the candle he had given me and returned to the hermitage, even knowing that it was a bad idea. The hermitage was dark and silent, but I felt not. The shadows were alone on the walls, moved as if they had their own lives, and the air was heavy, hard to breathe. On the altar, the friar's prayer manuscript still. I was open on a scheduled page. I approached and saw that he had noted something on the bank of the page: purify the place, burning the source faith. Above all, I didn't completely understand, but I knew I had to do something with the coffin. Everything I found in the hermitage, candlefells, Foster, baked water, and went back to the grave. Walk to the tomb was the longest of my life. The cemetery was taken by voices and shadows that danced around me. When I got there, the coffin was open and the body had disappeared. I did what I could: pour out the holy water in the tomb, lit the candles, and began to pray in high whisper, using the words of the manuscript. The voices around me increased, shouting, by cursing, laughing, but I continued. Suddenly I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. When I turned, she was there with her eyes full of hate, but now there was something different. She looked weaker. I took the lit candle and threw the fire, spread quickly the shadows, and for a moment all to my around her cry echoed in the cemetery until the stillness returned to his knees. Exhausted by looking at the flames that burned what was left of the curse, I thought it was over. But in the distance, in the stillness of the dawn, I heard one last murmur: "This is not the end." When the fire deleted, everything was in, still the common pair of the cemetery, but something different, almost suffocating. I felt as if the air around me was imprisoned, immovable by a moment I thought I was. over that the nightmare was finally over, but so I remembered that final murmur. This is not the end. I was kneeling side of the tomb for a while, looking at the burnt earth and the melted candles. The lady's body was not more there. And that was what worried me the most, where she was, that I really destroyed wickedness or just released it, these questions. But I knew I couldn't stay there. I came back to my residence, but not. I managed to sleep. My eyes weighed, my head throbbed, and my hand was still, shaking to hold the crucifix so hard. Everything I wanted was that ended. But something at the bottom of my chest said I still had more to come to next morning. I went to the temple to look for Friar Samuel, but he doesn't. The temple was empty, and his only sign was the manuscript of prayers that he always carried, now left open on the altar. I looked at the manuscript, trying to find some clue, but there was nothing beyond those same notes I had already seen. Purify the place to burn the source. Faith above all. I sat on the bank of the temple, trying to understand what to do, was alone. The fray had disappeared, and no one in the village seemed even to notice what was happening. When I returned to the cemetery, I realized something strange. Despite everything that had happened the night before, the place seemed calm, too much. The shadows no longer danced between the tombs, and the voices had missing for a moment. I thought that perhaps it had worked. Perhaps the entity I was gone. But as I passed the hermitage, I noticed something that made me stop. Door was ajar, and inside there was a smooth sound, almost imperceptible when I entered. I felt the air freezing in the center of the hermitage, where the altar was before. There was something that should not be there, a mirror, an old mirror with frame, spotted gold and full of cracking. I had never seen it before, but to approaching, I felt a presence. My reflection was there, but something was wrong. My image did not move as I should while I was stopped. My reflection. I leaned my head as if I was studying me, then that I heard her whisper again, but this time came from inside the mirror. You can't escape from me, Gael. I retreated, almost stumbling in the broken seats. The image in the mirror changed. It was no longer. I was she, the lady. She was there staring at me with those empty eyes, and his mouth moved, but there was no whisper before I could react. Mirror began to crack, and a sharp sound took over the chapel tapé, his ears. But it was no use. The cracks spread until the whole mirror exploded by throwing me against the wall. When the dust settled, I looked at where the mirror was. There was nothing else there, only the empty altar. I didn't know what to do. The fire anymore had not been the enough. She was still stuck between the living world and that of the dead, and I was the connection between the two. I went back to exhausted and disoriented residence, a bottle of cachaça, and sat on the table trying to organize my thoughts, what she wanted. I was not fair, for I was only the guardian of the graves, had no ask to get involved with. Nothing of this was then that I realized. On the table next to the bottle was the crucifix that I had taken to the tomb the night before, but there was something different in him. He was hot, as if he had been left in the sun. I took him with careful, and when I touched, a strange sensation I traveled. My body was not pain, but it wasn't comfort for either, if the crucifix was telling me something. At that moment, it all made sense. The friar was right. I needed to purify the completely, not only the grave of her, to her hermit, the cemetery, my own residence. Everything was contaminated by her presence. And if I wanted to end it once and for all, I would have to face the entity. There was no way to escape. I looked at the cemetery by the opening. The mist was beginning to get up again, covering the tombstone. The shadows were coming back. I took the crucifix, the manuscript of prayers, and everything I could carry. It was time to end it, and I knew this time, it would be all or nothing. That night I left home with a heavy chest, and the crucifix firm in the hand, knew that he could not go back. The cemetery was taken by a darkness that seemed to breathe throb. The tombstone seemed higher, the shadows longer. Every step I took was like entering even deeper into the mouth of a monster. Of my first stop was the hermitage. That place was the heart of perversity. The point where everything seemed to converge, the altar, was empty, but I knew I was there. You can feel when something is watching you, even if you can't see. I put the candles around the circle-shaped altar and began to pour out holy water. As I prayed, my words were weak at first, but I knew I couldn't stop, sir. This place purifies this land, removes wickedness from now on. The chapel trembled, the ground vibrated under my feet, and a cold breeze sweeping the place, erasing all the candles of one time before I could rekindle. I heard her laugh. "You think you can sending away so easily," her whisper echoed on the walls. I didn't answer. I continued to pray, now louder, holding the crucifix toward the altar. The sound around me increased, laughter, shouts, murmurs. I felt a pressure on my chest, as if something was trying to crush me inside. Suddenly, she appeared to the lady, or whatever it was stopped at the hermitage entrance. But she didn't look like human. His body was twisted, and his face was a mask of hate, with eyes black, like the emptiness you are in. "My Gael territory, and I will purify it," I shouted with all the force I had, "sir. I trust you purify this place." The fire around the tomb increased, and the shadows, they started backward, but the lady didn't stop. She stared at me with those empty eyes, and for a moment I felt she was going win. But then something changed. The crucifix I held started to shine a so strong light that it seemed to come directly from the sky. The lady shouted back, and the shadows disappeared. No, that cannot end like this," she shouted before being consumed by light. When everything finished, the cemetery was in quiet again. The fire had off, and the tomb was empty. I fell on my knees exhausted, but I knew I had. In the end, the wicked had been banned. The days that followed were strange. Cemetery seemed different, more relaxed, almost as if it had returned to normal. The residents of the village who once avoided the place began to appear new, bringing flowers to the tombs of their loved ones. About me, that was the time to leave that craft after all that happened. I knew that could not continue there, not because I had fear, but because I felt that my mission had ended before I left. I went to the temple one last time. Fray Samuel was never found, but his manuscript was still there. I took the manuscript, and the eye left on the altar as a memory of what he tried to do that night. When I last left the cemetery, I looked back and felt a relief that had never felt the place before was at peace. But deep down, a little. And doubt still haunted me. Was she really left forever years later? I heard reports that the cemetery had been closed. The authorities said it was because of reforms, but some people in the village whispered that strange entities started to happen again. I don't know if it was true, but to me the important thing is that I did what I could today, alive away from the village in a quiet place. But sometimes, when the breeze blows at night, I still hear murmurs in the distance, as if it were calling me. And you believe that the dead can carry with them secrets. Dark, what I would do, instead of Gael. Leave your opinion and share this history if you had the courage to reach the end. After all, sometimes wickedness is not buried so easily, thanks.